Hey guys, Chris here from the Ultimate Recycler. Here's a old trolley upside down. I picked this up from a garage sale for $5 many years ago, thinking it'd be handy in my backyard, and I still think that. Now, it was super cheap because 3 of the 4 wheels are absolutely rusted solid. No movement at all. That one's supposed to pivot as well. The 2 back ones pivot. This one actually does move. So it's the only wheel on the trolley that actually moves. The rest of them are absolutely frozen solid. So in this video, I just thought I'd show you a few basic tips for those who follow my channel that aren't qualified engineers or haven't had a lifetime of mechanics. So I like to share some basic tips. Plenty of you will know all these, and feel free to add any other comments in down below if you've got any other tips. But what I'm going to show you basically is how to free these wheels up, and we'll put a top on the trolley then and make it a useful trolley for my backyard. First rule, and very important rule, do not use adjustable pliers, some plumbers, Stilsons, or even a shifter, any sort of adjustable wrench, because these bolts are tight. They've been frozen for a long time. The thing's been in my backyard for quite a few years, even after I've got it. So we've got to undo these nuts, and they've rust welded themselves on there. So what you need to do is grab yourself a good size, exact size, good quality ring spanner. Now don't even be tempted to use the open ender, because these are going to need a lot of force and you'll end up springing the jaws and it'll slip off and possibly round the hex on the nut. So a really good fit, exact size ring spanner is what we need. And the other important thing to do is be patient. I went around and sprayed all these with a spray lube. I just used a WD-40. It doesn't really matter what. You can get much better quality ones than this. But the important thing is to get some spray in there, both in on the axle and around the thread on the nut. Take that spinner off there. So I sprayed these about a week or 2 ago, and every time I went past I gave them another spray, both sides, because that needs to get in there and start to penetrate into the rusted areas. Now it's important to realize what rust is. It's actually an oxide of the iron, ferrous oxide, and when it forms, and you can see it in a lot of spots, you get that extra shale that comes off, and you'll find badly rusted sections you can actually chip off essentially flakes of metal. And it's not actually metal, it's the oxide, and it expands and it forms the function, or it has the effect of making the bolts actually thicker than what they were originally, which means that they actually swell up inside the hub of the wheel. And I've seen them to the extent where it actually can end up splitting the wheel on a plastic wheel or a small bush or something, because they essentially just grow in diameter. So we need to get spray lube in there. We need to get a lot of turning force to start to free up the where the bolt goes through. Now there's a good chance that even with a good fitting spanner you're not going to be able to move this. It's rusted solid. So an easy trick there is to extend the length of your spanner, and I always keep a few various pieces of steel around the yard that slip over spanners, and what that does is it actually extends your leverage, and twice the length of the spanner will give you twice the turning torque on the nut. Still going to be tight, and we get to the stage of you hear that cracked, and that's actually broken the seal. All we've done at this stage is just crack the nut on the thread. We haven't done anything with the bolt through the wheel yet, but handy to keep a piece of pipe around, and that's why you need a good sized ring spanner, so that there's no danger of it slipping off and you're taking skin off your knuckles and you're damaging the nut or your spanner. Now if you find your pipe isn't long enough, or you can't find a piece of pipe, and you just can't simply get enough pressure to crack the nut, here's another trick to help. If you get yourself a cold chisel and get it on the flat of the nut and give it a sharp quick tap, and if you can try and get some of the other flats as well, what that will do, it will jar the nut on the thread of the bolt and actually break the seal as well. And you'll find a few hits around the nut will make a big difference to getting it off. If it's totally frozen solid, you could actually cold chisel in far enough to almost cut the nut off. In severe cases that's sometimes necessary, and generally it doesn't waste the bolt. Generally you can still reuse the bolt. Now this is undoing nicely now that we've loosened the thread, and we've had plenty of spray lube in there over the last week. So the only other way I'm going to mention as far as freeing up a seized or rusted nut is probably one of the most common methods is heat. Now clearly we're limited now because we've got a plastic wheel. We can't apply heat to this because it would start to melt the hub. But if this was a cast iron wheel, or the bolt was going through just a heavy piece of steel, you certainly can have great success for those of you that have got a way of heating it. Oxyacetylene or gas torch, that sort of stuff. If you heat the nut and then quench it quickly, you'll get a shock, a thermo shock I guess you'd call it, and it will break the seal, so that would work well. You can also just cut the nut off with an oxyacetylene, so there's a number of ways there, but a lot of us haven't got that equipment. So these are the ways that I find that works really well. Certainly the cold chisel is a great way for jarring, and once you get it to move a bit, you could just whack it on the flat a couple of times and it will free up quite well, and it won't damage the bolt at all. And in this case we didn't cut into it enough to really damage the nut either. So that's how we freed the nut up. Now we've still got the problem of everything else being super solid. The wheel is still frozen, so now we're going to look at knocking the bolt out. And I've left the nut on there at this stage. I'm not taking it right off because we want to try and jar it that way, and we're going to get a good mash hammer onto it and see if we can free it up, and I'll show you why I'm leaving that nut on there in a tick. Okay, now this is a mash hammer. It's just quite a short handle but a good solid heavy head, which means that we can get a fair bit of punch with it with a relatively small backswing, which is kind of important here because we have the other wheel on the other side. Now I've got the nut off at the moment, and if I was to give that a tap and be slightly off center, I'm going to flatten the corner of the thread, which is going to render the bolt or basically damage the bolt, and we won't be able to thread the nut back on without having to file back the damaged thread. The more we hit it with the hammer to try and get it through the seized part, the more we're going to damage it, and eventually it will actually mushroom out, which essentially not only destroys the bolt, but then we'll have a near impossible task of punching it right through the wheel because this will be a lot fatter. So we'll leave the nut on, and we'll do the nut up so that it's flush with the end of the bolt. That way when we give it a decent hit square on, most of the force is actually being carried by the thread rather than the end of the bolt, and it won't damage the nut or serve the purpose of protecting the thread. So now the next thing we need to consider, in fact we could give it a bit of a whack here and just see how tight it really is in the frame. Alright, that doesn't feel like it's going to move at all. So something to consider is that we need to shock load it. Now to provide a really sharp shock right down the shank of the bolt, we need to stop any flex, and because these brackets here, even though they're fairly thick steel to look at, they're still going to absorb some of the shock, as in the whole assembly is just going to push across a little bit as we hammer it, which is taking away that really sharp impact that we want for the bolt shank to go through the hub. So what I'm going to do is turn the thing on its side, and I'm going to support this bracket either side of the bolt head so that most of our force, a high percentage of our force, will be travelling through the bolt and not being absorbed by the whole assembly. Okay, so I've got the bracket supported underneath. I've actually got a very heavy piece of steel here with a slotted section. I don't even know what these were from. I picked them up years ago, and they weigh about 10 kilos. I've got quite a few of them, and they're really handy for jobs like this. You could use a couple of heavy pieces of angle iron, or probably even concrete blocks or something, just to give that support underneath the other side what we're doing is supporting it across that section and across that section, and that will hold the whole frame up solid, and it won't move at all when we give a pounding impact through the nut there. So we'll give it a go and see what happens. Okay, let's roll it over and have a look. I think it moved. We've given ourselves every chance, and look at that. It's now opened up underneath that bolt head. So now that we've got it actually travelling, it's loosened the bolt head right up, but the bolt is still actually turning with the wheel. But now that we've actually got some movement, I'm going to spray a bit more spray on that side. I'll actually tap it back in and then tap it back out again, and I think we should be able to start to move the wheel. Okay, we'll see if we can move the wheel. It's still very tight. We'll have to work it back and forward a little bit. Okay, now things are freeing up a fair bit. It's acceptable at this stage to use a shifter to hold the bolt head, and as I mentioned earlier, you could use a socket as well, but don't use a socket or a ratchet when you're trying to free up a seized one, because the ratchet probably won't handle the pressure. You're much better off sticking with a good fitting ring spanner. Alright, that should tap out now more easily without damaging the thread. It's coming out. We want to be a bit patient. We'll just turn it a little bit as we go, get a bit more spray in there, and hammer it back through a bit. You're much better taking a little bit more time to do it at this stage rather than being impatient and end up damaging the thread by hitting it harder than you need to. It's starting to free up nicely now. And voila, look at that. So even after a week soaking, the spray didn't get right into the middle of it, but it certainly did get into a fair way. Now there has a steel bush in here, which I didn't realise, and that's why it's rusted together. But we'll just run a round file through that, clean it out a bit. The bolt's perfectly usable. We can still use the nut. So it really just needs to clean up, a little bit of grease in there, and we'll have a perfectly operational wheel. And then we just repeat for the other ones. And there we have it, all the wheels removed, all the same process. They all put up a little bit of a fight, but we managed to work them free, loosened up. The only hiccup we had was that this one here, have a look at that, just sheared off. I didn't even put enormous amounts of pressure on it. Must be a bit of metal fatigue, but you know, certainly gives you an indication of how tight they were. So let's go and have a look. Luckily I found another bolt. As amazing as it sounds, I had one exactly the right size, even identical amounts of rust on it, so it's socially acceptable to have that replace this one. So that's all good. Let's go and have a look at the wheels, and I'll show you what I'm going to do with them. So here we go. Now the steel bushing fits fairly snugly in, well, a little bit of wear in the hub of the wheel. Now it's actually slightly wider than the wheel. As you can see, it's sitting on the base as the wheel is as well, so it's flush the other end, and it's sticking up probably a couple of mil, maybe 1.5 mil this side. So what happens is the bolts actually clamped the frame onto the bush so that that whole assembly was tight, and that allowed, when we did it the bolt up, did the nut up the other end. That allowed the frame to squash right in to jam on either side of the bush, and therefore this whole assembly was rigid, so the bolt didn't need to spin inside the bush, and the fact that it was rusted solid in there kind of didn't really matter. But the bush then became the axle for the wheel to spin on the outside. Now they froze up, and obviously the plastic wheel hub isn't going to rust. And what I was talking about earlier was that how metal swells when it rusts. Have a look at these ones I haven't cleaned up compared to this one that I've belted with a hammer quite a bit, and all the flaky rust came off it. And you can see how that's a much larger diameter. In fact, if we measure that, that looks like it probably would have been imperial, but that's just a whisker over 20 mil, almost 21. And if we measure the hub of the wheel, that's actually right on 20. So it's essentially an interference fit, so any wonder the thing wouldn't turn. So that just goes to show how the metal can actually grow and expand with the rust or the ferrous oxide growing on it. So what I'm going to do with these, one of them wasn't too bad. This one was pretty reasonable actually. Might have been the one that was still spinning. I ended up taking that one apart anyway because I figured I'm going to have them all greased and running smoothly. I might as well do the lot of them. So that one's okay. This one where I've hammered a lot is fine. We'll clean these ones up a bit just by giving them a good shock load with the hammer and maybe a quick file to neaten them up. Then we need to grease the outside of these as we put them back in the assembly. We'll also smear a bit of grease on the inside. Even though it doesn't need to spin, it'll just help the thing knock apart if ever we need to do it in the future. The grease will certainly stop rusting. So all we need to do now is get some grease, clean up these other bushes. We've got all our enough bolts, and we can put it together. Alright, we've got a liberal coating of grease here. I don't know what grease it is. It's a BP brand one. It was in a tin I got out of a shed many years ago. It's been floating around my shed, because you never know when you'll need a bit of grease. So that'll give it a good coating in there. We'll leave a bit in the middle there for the bolt to push in, and then the bolt will have a bit of grease, and we'll also coat the shank, but we need to fit it now in the bracket. And we'll smear a bit on this bolt, and it won't hurt to have a bit on the thread too, just to lubricate the nut. And it all should be well and truly lubricated. We shouldn't get any serious rust in there for a long time. Now line the hole up. Beautiful. Now we just need to do the nut up. It's that easy. Beautiful. All done. There we go. Wheels back on, ready to do another 1,000,000 or so miles. They roll beautifully. A little bit of slop in them. That one's actually very good, but some of them had a little bit of extra wear in the plastic hub. But they spin great. Look at that. Beautiful. Now the only thing is, I did get the other pivot to free up. This was the one that was seized. This one was always free, but it's a little bit worn. And I've freed them up really just with the spray lube, but I'm going to try and get some grease into the ball bearings in there, because grease will last a lot longer. The spray lube will evaporate fairly quickly, and the grease also tends to repel the water and keep the water out of it, so they shouldn't rust up quite so easily. But really that's all we have to do. All four wheels spin beautifully. Job's finished. We'll turn it over and go for a little push. All I need to do now is I'll just flip it over, and I'm just going to get some old pallet timber and make a little tray for the top of it. And look at that. Beautiful. It's going to steer really well with those back wheels pivoting. Yeah, that one's jammed a little bit, so going to need a bit of grease in those. But the good thing with these wheels, I'm not going to get flats. They're a wide enough wheel that they'll push over the soil quite easily. So it's great. This will be a really handy trolley for my backyard. Alright, thanks for watching. Hope you got some tips out of that that's handy for you. Like I said, anyone that's had a bit of experience will probably know all this. Feel free to add some comments below if you want to add something I might have overlooked. In the meantime, look out for my next video. Catch you later.